Welcome then to Major General Chip Chapman, a former senior military advisor. Chip, good evening to you.
Good evening, John.
Chip, welcome. Can you give me your latest assessment then on the state of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, tactically, it's bogged down at the moment due to the heavy rain and mud. So we're not going to see any movement in offensive operations from any side for at least another week. But what we are seeing is the continual attritional battle around Bakhmut, which is turning really, from a Russian perspective, into a Severodonetsk Mark II. And of course, that was the place where really Ukraine killed off the first echelon of the professional Russian army. Now, what we're seeing around Bakhmut really is the killing off of the first part of the second echelon with the Wagner mercenaries and really the untrained first bit of the mobilized forces. And I rather liked my old boss, General Mattis' line on this that we're watching Russia wither before our eyes, the immoral, the tactically incompetent, operationally stupid, and strategically foolish effort of Russia. And I think all of that is true. But what's really struck me this week, if you look at the multipolar world as people like to see it for the future, particularly with what is happening in Iran, with the women life freedom chant, massive protests there, and in Russia, the rioting and zero COVID chaos that we're seeing there. What are we actually seeing from the people in Russia?
Mm,
And what we're seeing from the people in Russia is absolutely nothing. We're seeing a benign population with no protests at home of any scope, as we've seen in Iran and China, and nothing with the diaspora, the hundreds of thousands who fled Russia afterwards. And this is slightly perplexing in the sense that Russian propaganda is now not being believed at home in the way it was before. So the
yes.
main Russian or Moscow sponsored channels are seeing a 25% drop in their numbers, and more people are turning to sort of encrypted apps and the internet to try and get a better position of the war. So they might not be anti-war. They're not turning out in great numbers, but that doesn't mean that they don't want the Russian army and the Russian state to succeed. If
Yes.
you reverse that side, we're seeing the Ukrainian people still absolutely hard over on supporting their government too. So we've got a clash of the titans in a way in both of the populations at the moment. So we're a long, long way from any sort of notions of negotiations or ceasefires for the future.
Tell me, I guess we can't know this definitively, Chip, but are we at or even past the point where it is beyond the capacity of Russia to regroup, rearm, and make and have another go at this at some point in the future? Is this now just an inevitable path towards complete failure?
I don't think you can definitively say that. And the reason that I mentioned that is because so geoeconomic theories of warfare were very vogue 30 years ago. And at the moment, there's a school on the mobilization of the Russians or further mobilization, the realist school, as it were, which would say you can't do this because it would be economically crushing to Russia. But Putin is not an economist, he's not a bookkeeper, he's not an accountant. He's a xenophobe, he wants a greater Russia. He's prepared to take a lot more casualties and mobilize a lot more of the society, even though the means aren't there at the moment in terms of, boots, armored vehicles, and things like that. He is not an accountant. He doesn't look at the world like that. He will just say, make it happen, and doesn't really care if people are wearing sort of the equivalent of flip flops but have an AK-47 to go and join the front line.
Yeah.
He's prepared to take a lot more casualties than they've taken at the moment. So we shouldn't definitively say that we've reached the entire culmination of the Russian state. A logical way would say that is true, but war has a illogical motive about it in lots of ways.
Right, and turning the lens round and looking, as it were, at our side of things, we're going to hear the Prime Minister give an important speech in just over an hour's time at the Guildhall, foreign policy speech. And we understand that he's going to be saying in that speech that Britain will continue or increase support for Ukraine, which is running at a pretty significant level. Would you describe that as a good investment, as well as being, morally the right thing to do? Is it a good investment in that expenditure of treasure is investing in the weakness of an important potential adversary?
Of course, I do, because I see Russia as a neo imperialist state whose prime strategic objective is to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. if it bites and hoe in Ukraine, it won't stop in terms of what it sees as its vital interest. It will come again in 5, 10, or 15 years' time. It will try and gobble up the Baltic states and possibly Poland. And so there will be no lasting peace if the aggressor wins, if oppression and autocracy prevail over freedom and democracy. That is the key issue ultimately, and it's worth investing that treasure. And it's not that much treasure when you look at the Americans and the GDP of some of the other countries, particularly those Baltic states that I mentioned. So it is absolutely just, right, and ethically the right thing to do to morally support.
And is Britain in particular giving Ukraine smart support? Because I read that Britain's now ready to provide Brimstone 2 missiles. These are precision guided missiles, aren't they? Will that add significantly to Ukraine's capacity?
Well, it won't add to the capacity that much, but precision guided munitions are always a welcome addition to the inventory because they give you a technical edge over the Russians who seem to be running out of that. Again, I'd be hesitant to say that's completely true because again, they can potentially get sources from the grey market and and other maligned states. So there's still a lot to come to play for in this war,
Yes.
and war as a way of biting both sides. So again, I've said before, a straight line linear prediction of where this will go is folly, really.
And it's not just about the highly sophisticated ordnance, is it? I'm also reading Boeing, the corporation Boeing, is talking about supplying small precision bombs that can be fitted to low tech rockets. It operates at both ends of the technology scale.
That's true, but ultimately you have to remember that war is fought for political objectives. Neither side is near to achieving any of those objectives. The clear one from Ukraine's perspective is to regain the territory that they've lost pre-1991, including Ukraine. And I still think Russia has maximalist objectives, which is to absolutely knock over Ukraine and its political polity for the future.
All right, Chip, lovely to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. Major General Chip Chapman there. And I think we can now talk to a guest on a particularly appalling aspect of the war in Ukraine, the use of sexual violence by Russian forces as a weapon of war. I want to talk now to Lysia Valenenko, who is joining us, I think, from Kyiv, the Ukrainian MP from the Golos Party. Lysia, good evening to you.
Good evening.
Lysia, welcome. We've been learning more and more about this aspect of the war in Ukraine. It is a truly horrifying aspect of that war. The use of sexual violence by Russian forces, a really shocking feature, which must hit home, I think, well, more than to anyone, to you and people there in that country seeing these reports.
You are absolutely right, and this is exactly what we have been talking today, and we'll be talking about tomorrow at the PSVI conference in the UK, organized by the Foreign Office, talking about sexual violence in zones of conflict. Russia's aggression on Ukraine, against Ukraine, has taken the most horrific form when the strategy of Russia's military is to target civilians and to invoke the most pain and terror on innocent people and on the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Sexual violence is being used as a weapon of rape, being used as a weapon of war. Today, 43 cases of sexual violence have been committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women and children have been documented and have been put forward in front of the prosecutor's office of Ukraine. We are talking about cases where children as young as 4 years old have been raped and women as old as 85 years old have been raped. And what we know today is that really this is not just exclusions or exemptions or just cases where a soldier has gone rogue, but really that this has been the strategy of the Russian army.
Yes, we're seeing reports, more and more of them now, of this kind of violence, the rape of women, the rape of children, very young children, and men are victims too, victims of castration, and that kind of violence, and as you say, taking place with the approval or on the orders of Russian commanders. It suggested also that victims of this violence aren't necessarily getting all the sort of support that they would wish. Just tell us more about that.
When we are talking about castration, that comes under the crimes of torture that have been committed pretty much all over the occupied territories that have been held hostage by the Russian military, by the Russian soldiers. Just recently, in deoccupied Kherson region, there have been located 9 torture chambers, 9 torture locations, where all kinds of bodily harm have been administered to Ukrainian men and women just because they were Ukrainian. And again, today, speaking at the conference, many times that I have to speak on this absolutely devastating and tragic subject, I have to underline the fact that this is a strategy used by the Russian military rather than just a haphazard situation. And this is the difference between the army of the aggressor state of Russia and the army of Ukraine, who's acting as a defender, as a victim. In the Ukrainian military, we have almost we always make the point of educating our soldiers about the crimes of sexual violence, what it entails, how to deal with the victims. And we see that our soldiers are very, very open to this kind of information and are very open to countering any kind of behavior that may show signs of sexual violence,
Yes.
especially against the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, that is to say, women and children.
It is an appalling, appalling crime.